Welcome to the debate. I'm your host, Sana Maqbool, once again here with you at C2B World. And of course, as always, we will be bringing you some of the very important stories around the world. In today's show, we have two very important stories which we'll be looking at. But of course, the third one is going on at the moment, which is of course the match between Pakistan and Australia, the semi-final of the ICC T20 World Cup, in which the earlier innings, Pakistan has played remarkably well, scoring 176 with a loss of 4 wickets in the allotted 20 overs, setting a target of 177 for Australia to chase, and they're already 1 wicket down. And Pakistan has played remarkably well in the entire tournament so far. They have had a winning streak of 5 matches, and we hope that the winning streak continues because now we don't have any room for losses. We want them to win this semi-final and of course the final as well. By the time we reach the end of this show, hopefully we will be closer to victory, and we'll talk more about this. But in the debate, we also have two other important stories that we need to talk about. First of all, of course, is the Troika Plus meeting with regards to Afghanistan, in which Pakistan, Russia, US have participated. And of course, it is extremely important regarding what is going on in Afghanistan and the evolving situation there. What sort of commitment can the Taliban be giving to the international community? How much of a role Pakistan and the rest of the countries can play in this regard? Also, how much of an emphasis can be put on the US as well to also unfreeze the $9.5 billion that of course are in Afghanistan's central bank reserves? And this is extremely important because the economic collapse in the country is quite daunting as well. Foreign Minister Sana Maqbool also earlier pointed out to the fact that, of course, these are concerns that are relevant to everyone. These are common concerns, and so there is a common responsibility towards also resolving the situation in Afghanistan. How much the countries can actually negotiate in terms of making the Taliban ensure them that they fulfill their international commitments, while also playing their own responsible role towards helping avert a humanitarian and economic crisis in Afghanistan, is what we will be discussing further. Meanwhile, we will also be looking at Xi Jinping, the president of China's remarks recently regarding warning of a situation which is similar to the Asia-Pacific Cold War era, of course pointing towards the US problems that they've had over the years, and of course quite recently with the Biden administration, and of course over Taiwan. This is extremely important to understand considering we saw in the Glasgow summit perhaps a possibility of thawing of relations between the US and China, and of course the Biden administration is also trying to establish a pragmatic role. There may be a meeting expected between the two leaders. The date is not set yet, but whether or not such a meeting will be taking place, can the US and China move forward towards resolving their issues and actually thawing their relations, while at the same time we have issues over Taiwan, and then of course alliances that are also springing up in the region, which of course are a concern to China. So we'll be taking a look at both of these issues in the debate today. For the first topic, we have been joined by respected guests on the show. We have our foreign affairs expert, Mr. Tariq Farhadi, who has joined us, and we've also been joined by senior analyst, Brigadier Retired Saad Mohammed. Thank you very much for joining us. And of course, we also have Mr. Farooq Batafi and Raja Faisal, regular analysts on our show, but nonetheless, expert opinions of theirs is also very vital to the show. So let's, of course, first start off with the fact that Afghanistan's Troika Plus meeting is something that Pakistan is hosting, and Pakistan, of course, has played a remarkably vital role in the entire process in Afghanistan so far, and it continues to do so and has an important role to play both with regards to how the situation has evolved and also its geostrategic location. Considering all of this, I'll start first of all with Mr. Farhadi and the fact that a lot of such initiatives seem to be springing up in the region as well. Pakistan, being of course an important stakeholder in this regard, has a very important role to play. It's brought together Russia and the US at the same table as well, which is very important in terms of moving towards a real resolution towards averting the economic and humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. How much do you expect this conference to result in a tangible action for the Afghanistan government in terms of the international community actually easing on its conditions before moving forward towards recognition of the government, or moving towards something that helps the people of Afghanistan?
Greetings to you and all the best wishes for Pakistan with the cricket match.
Thank you very much.
Look, this is a Troika meeting. There was one in Russia, Moscow, after the fall of the former regime. There was one in Doha, and today in Islamabad. And what's very interesting to note is that the Troika's message is the same. A government which is broad-based, control terrorism, and human rights, and broad-based government in Afghanistan. The same message, Troika Plus, because Pakistan is part of this meeting. The same message has been given to Taliban by 3 members of the UN Security Council, which are also member of the UN Credentials Committee, and the Taliban haven't budged. The Taliban might have been good at patience and the 20 years of war, but they need to know that diplomacy is the art of adjustment, give and take. And they have not changed their position on broadening the government or announcing a concrete date on when all the women's school will be open. This is important for a Western audience. So they might go back to Kabul without anything more than when they left Doha a few weeks ago, or when they left Moscow a few weeks earlier. I have been giving them the same message, is look, you have to have now an intra-Taliban conversation inside Afghanistan and say, which way do we want to go? We want to keep it this way, we might risk not being recognized at all by the international community. And at some point the international community will get tired of us, or we have to make some adjustments and accept the others in governance, and then we will save Afghanistan. Because the subject of recognition of Afghanistan is a matter of benefit for all the Afghan citizens.
Right. So, Brigadier Saad, considering the fact that the Taliban seem quite rigid on their stance in this position, so does the international community as far as recognition is concerned. What do you see moving forward in terms of the economic crisis and humanitarian crisis that is looming over Afghanistan at the moment? Will the Taliban risk such a crisis in Afghanistan and not change their position? They have made commitments verbally saying that their government will be inclusive, and of course they want to engage with the international community, but it doesn't seem to be the case.
Yes, I agree. Thus far, the Taliban government has been a disappointment in a way that there are 2 major crises which are emerging in Afghanistan, and they can only be, addressed. Those challenges can be addressed if the Taliban show flexibility and they increase the range of their friends rather than annoying people or sticking to isolationist policies. And those 2 challenges that I refer to are, it's the humanitarian crisis, which is emerging. People are selling their daughters. It's heartbreaking for a mother to be, selling her daughter who is an infant. And the second is the security challenges, which mostly are now posed by the Islamic State remnants which are there in Afghanistan. And they are a deadly lot. And if they somehow succeed from their base in eastern Afghanistan, not only that they will destabilize Afghanistan, they will also destabilize the neighboring Pakistan. So the Taliban have to show flexibility in their positions. And the international community will only come up with recognition, with releasing their funds and helping them overcome the security challenges through the electronic intelligence, the chatter, the other indicators that come on the electronic spectra. So what we have to do is Pakistan must keep applying pressure on the Afghan government, the Taliban government, that they need to show to the world that the commitments that they made in Doha, they must be complied with. If they don't, The sufferers will not only be the Taliban government, I will see suffering in Afghanistan, which at this point is in a meltdown situation. The economy is in a meltdown situation. They cannot even do trading with the outside world. So,
right, of course.
The moment better health prevails, situation will improve.
Right. So considering the situation and the stance that the Taliban has been putting forward, Faisal, Pakistan, of course, has an extremely vital role to play in this regard. Do you think that Pakistan can help in the flexibility issues that we're facing from the Taliban side? Can Pakistan enable the Taliban to be a bit more flexible?
Sana, all I can say is Pakistan has been trying, and you very well know that Prime Minister of Pakistan, he kept on mentioning this, that Pakistan is in the favor of an inclusive setup within Afghanistan since the day one. And Prime Minister of Pakistan wanted the government of Afghanistan with Taliban, obviously led by Taliban, but it should be an inclusive government so that it can be accepted by the Western countries and the most powerful countries of the world. And right now, how I see it, that Pakistan itself is struggling to advocate for Afghanistan and for the rule of Taliban. All Pakistan wants is peace and economic stability of Afghanistan. That's why Pakistan has been, trying to facilitate all of the efforts to, calm down the situation in Afghanistan, as well as Pakistan has been advocating in past to the Western world. Especially Pakistan has been, demanding from and requesting from the Americans to unfreeze $9.5 billion of Afghan Central Bank, only because of one reason, that Pakistan does not want an economic chaos in Afghanistan, because if the economic chaos takes place, which we already are heading towards, then the situation would be very dire. And as as Brigadier Saad has just mentioned, that people are selling their daughters, we might be seeing these kind of situation in coming future more often, and it would be very heartening to see if it continues, because the situations are very tight in Afghanistan, and of course, if something goes wrong in Afghanistan, the impact on Pakistan would be very bad.
Right. Farooq, considering that the international community is still hesitant to recognize the government and it has its preconditions, is that a prerequisite to the international community helping out in terms of the economic and humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan?
Well, Sana, thank you very much for the opportunity regarding this excellent question. Let me tell you, at this moment, as per the international law goes, Afghanistan doesn't have a government. Afghanistan at this moment has a government-shaped hole, which might be temporarily filled by Afghan Taliban's interim government, but since the international community doesn't recognize Taliban government rule, and the previous ruler actually just folded up and quit and left, after that situation is really dire. When it comes to aiding Afghan people, we have seen various stakeholders committing. For example, the US has doubled its commitment. Similarly, the UN, the EU, Germany particularly, they all have made very generous pledges. But that doesn't actually, undercut the fact that till the time you don't have a government, a functioning government in Kabul, or it is recognized, you cannot move far. Now, what is the ask when you talk about the international expectations? They are exactly the commitments that were made in Doha. And in Doha, there were particularly three basic things that happened. The first two were essential, that Afghan territory will not be used against any country. At this moment, we know because of ISIS case rise, they are struggling with that idea. There is some problem. They have committed that they are going to get rid of ETIM, IMU, and then of course Al-Qaeda as well, and ISIS-K too. The second thing was humanitarian aspect or human rights aspect. There again, there seems to be some problem, right? And finally, when it comes to their expectations are two Afghan Taliban. One, legitimacy or recognition. That is not going to come that easily. The second one is unfreezing of international, their forex reserves that are parked at this moment, most of them in New York City. So at this moment, the negotiations go on, but the problem with Afghan Taliban is that I am not going to expect an inclusive government in very soon. Why? And that was the third very important expectation from them. Why? Because at this moment, the Taliban themselves are at loggerheads with each other. They are divided, as I pointed out last time I spoke to you. At this moment, humanitarian aspect might be taken care of, but the problem is because of the exodus of Afghani bureaucracy and technocrats. They don't have the infrastructure on the ground, and because of that, NGOs might be able to fill in, but the Afghan Taliban's foot soldiers are really inflexible. So that is going to create a lot of problems in coming days as well.
Right. So the Troika Plus has also pledged to try and ease this pressure on Afghanistan's banking system and try and work towards the unfreezing of assets. Mr. Farhadi, is that something that the U.S. might be willing to consider?
Yes, but not today. It will take a long time. In the U.S., Afghanistan has turned into a liability for Joe Biden in the Congress. The way Joe Biden left and the images that the U.S. public were left on their TV screens shows that Joe Biden didn't handle well Afghanistan, so he doesn't have too much margin in the government to suddenly embrace the Taliban and freeze the money. While the Taliban haven't done anything different, you see, because the Republicans are on his case for good or bad reason. It's politics. Politics is like this. And Biden has congressional elections in 12 months in 2022. So I don't see the Afghan money being released, unfortunately, because of the infighting in the United States and because Biden doesn't want to look weak in vis-a-vis his Republican rivals. And the Taliban also, I've given this message to them as well, is if you want the money to be released, which is Afghanistan's money, you must improve your relations with the U.S. and you must do what the world wants. It's not very complicated. You are already doing some of it, but not enough, and you are not very articulate about it, and the diplomacy of the Taliban is very limited, let's face it.
Right. Brigadier Sir, considering that another very important aspect is, of course, the use of Afghan soil against any other country. We've seen attacks within Afghanistan as well. Is the Taliban government in the country in a position to ensure that their soil will not be used against any other territory?
You know, at this point in time, the government in Kabul is on the side of the hardliners. That's what it looks like. They're not showing any flexibility. And as long as they don't show flexibility, they will not get help to overcome the security challenges that face them. Now, we have these militant groups who have been fighting side by side with the Taliban. So there are groups within there are streams within the Taliban government who say these people have helped us during our war of liberation. And we just can't, discard them like that. So what is required of them at this point in time is that they forbid them from carrying out any terrorist activity outside the borders of Afghanistan. China will be worried about atom, the Central Asian states will be worried about IMU, Pakistan is worried about the TTP. So unless the Taliban address these issues, they will not be recognized and they will not get the assets that they want to. Now, what can happen is that Pakistan, China and Russia are important countries. Now, if the Taliban show some flexibility on the points raised in this discussion and what we agreed to in Doha, it will become easier for these three countries to begin the process of recognition. So then some aid can be funneled to the Taliban government, and the economic meltdown and the humanitarian crisis that the Afghan government is facing, that can be reduced. the United States, as one of your guests has just rightly said, recognition from the United States or release of their foreign exchange reserve is not coming anytime soon. That's politics, as he said, and I agree with that. But humanitarian aid channeled to the Afghan government can come from other countries, provided they show some level of, moving forward on the issues that they agreed to in Doha. Then we can proceed. Then the domino effect will start. Pakistan, China, and Russia recognize the government. Then the other countries will also come forward and start recognizing, and they will get the legitimacy that is required for channeling any aid, be that humanitarian aid or aid in combating the terrorists which are parked in Afghanistan at this point in time.
Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Farhadi and Brigadier Saad, for joining us and speaking to us on the very important issue of Afghanistan. Before we move on to the next topic of the show, just a quick comment from Farooq and Faisal. Farooq, considering the fact that the U.S. has spent about 2 decades in Afghanistan, and despite that and the Doha Agreement, the end was quite chaotic. If we're looking forward in terms of both sides upholding whatever they had agreed upon, aren't we looking at another dead end?
Right. At this moment, it surely seems like a dead end because the people who are ruling Afghanistan are the elements that the U.S. has been fighting for 20 years, right? And if they are going to recognize them, there is going to be blowback. We know how Western media works. It actually magnifies these issues and makes it a matter of surrender. But having said that, if concessions start coming from Afghan Taliban, particularly concession to their own people, then things are going to improve. The problem is that the commitment that was made by Doha office. And we know that there were 3 distinct elements within Taliban. One, the Doha office, the second, Haqqani network, and the third, Kandahari Taliban. The problem is that the first element that made commitments has been flushed out. It has been shunted to one side. So those commitments technically stand nowhere. So the good thing today, when the Troika Plus has met, is that the U.S. has come back to the meeting as well, and all the regional partners, and Afghan Taliban's foreign minister is also in town. So that actually gives you at least some hope that there can be some room for reconciliation.
Right. Faisal, quick comments. We have guests for the second show online with us.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that, as Brigadier Saad was, talking about that all of the circling countries, they do have problems that are somehow associated with Afghanistan, especially when it comes to Pakistan, TTP, ETIM for China, and then IMU. And all of these problems, why they took place. While Taliban were fighting against the Americans, they had very good relations with all of these factions, and they always had a breather in terms of facilitations and all of that from TTP, from ETIM, from IMU. So right now, I think talking about all of these groups is really important for the circling countries, and I think Taliban need to sit with Pakistan, China, and Central Asian republics, and they need to make sure that they need to ensure that nothing would be happening from Afghanistan in terms of terrorism and all these things. And especially when talking about ISIS Khorasan, I think ISIS Khorasan is not only problem for Pakistan or Afghanistan or the neighboring countries. It is a global problem, and when we talk about the global problem, ISIS Khorasan should be dealt with, and Taliban by themselves, they would not be able to deal with them. The countries throughout the world, they have to support them against ISIS Khorasan for the sake of prosperity and peace in the region.
Right, and that's what we hope for. We, of course, have to now move on to another very important dynamic, which is the U.S.-China relations, and, of course, Xi Jinping's recent warnings considering the relapse into Cold War-like era and the contradictions of that time. We, of course, need to analyze the situation between the Biden administration and Xi Jinping and whether or not there is a possibility of thawing of relations between the two countries. For this segment, we have been joined online by Associate Professor Professor of History at Frostburg State University, Maryland, USA, Mr. Haiyun Ma. Thank you very much for joining us. We've also been joined by senior analyst Michael Kugelman. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being with us on the show today. Considering, of course, the fact that we have seen since the Biden administration has been part of the U.S. regime, we've seen that there has been combative diplomatic exchanges between China and the U.S., while at the same time we have Xi Jinping remarking that a relapse of the Cold War-like situation may be possible. He also talked about how this should not be the case. We've seen that at the Glasgow summit, there was a possibility that perhaps climate change issues could bring the two administrations closer. Yet a one-on-one meeting between the two leaders is yet to be seen. How do you see the situation evolving, Mr. Haiyun, in the recent future, with the fact that perhaps a meeting is on the sidelines, that this is a possibility that the Biden administration and Xi Jinping may be looking at?
Hello, Sana. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think Xi Jinping's speech at the CPEC is a very important signal. Basically, try to tell the U.S. that China wants to improve their relationship. And also, you can imagine when Xi Jinping consolidated his position at the recent plenum, he will basically, of course, United States is the foundation for future relations with almost all countries. So that's why he basically sent this signal. And of course, when he talks about this, Asian Pacific security prosperity, he basically, I think, worry about the U.S., especially Trump legacy in Asian Pacific or Indo-Pacific, especially Quad and AUKUS, and also recently Taiwan issues. It seems China and the U.S. in the Indo-Pacific, they really, go to some kind of confrontation. So that's really a worry about China and Xi Jinping, especially when he consolidates his position. He really needs to think about how to improve Chinese economy in the future and how to stabilize the whole region. So that's why I think he gives this very important signal. And also I think not only in climate cooperation, but also possibly in Afghanistan and other issues, Xi Jinping and Biden probably will work further.
Right. Mr. Michael, China is, of course, really sensitive about issues with respect to Taiwan and other territorial issues as well. The U.S.'s recent congressional delegation visit to Taiwan is, of course, causing concerns within China. Considering this and the fact that Xi Jinping is planning to meet the Biden administration and that there is a possibility that talks may be held between the two countries, really on ground, what is the scenario, considering, of course, the situation with Taiwan, that the U.S. and China relations may be going towards?
Well, for those that thought that the Biden administration would take a softer approach to China than the Trump administration had, they were dead wrong. It's very true that this competition and rivalry between the U.S. and China has intensified for sure over the last few months. And I think that indeed Taiwan, has long been seen as a flashpoint in the rivalry and competition. But what's notable is the Biden administration has done some things vis-a-vis Taiwan that are very striking, and it goes back to the fact that the de facto Taiwan ambassador to Washington was invited to attend Biden's inauguration. It's the first time a U.S. president has ever done anything like that. And you've heard the messaging and the rhetoric from Biden administration officials on Taiwan has not been as ambiguous as it had been previously, indicating that there seems to be a genuine view in the administration that Taiwan may need more, potentially could get more direct support from the U.S. than had been thought before if there were to be some type of crisis or conflict in the region. So this is very troubling. It's very striking. I will say that the Biden administration has made the point that it wants to cooperate with China in areas that are possible and that would serve U.S. interests. And certainly climate change is one of the areas. It's such a big priority for Biden himself. And I think this is one area, this is one incentive or one reason that the Biden administration has to try to ensure that the relationship with China doesn't get so far out of control that there cannot be any space at all for some type of collaboration on an issue like climate change. That's the focus. But we've seen when high-level officials from both countries have gotten together to meet, doesn't always work out very well. There was that meeting in Alaska some months ago where there was actually a shouting match. So very tense, but I am cautiously optimistic that there still could be some scope for some cooperation.
Faisal, considering that there are really large issues that are already evolving in the situation between U.S. and China relations, and they play a key factor in the friction between the two countries, can issues or cooperation on issues such as the climate change actually pave the way for reconciliation, which has an effect on the relationship between the two countries, or is that something that can happen on the sidelines while at the same time the friction remains?
Sana, it's a very good question, and you know, I think taking up climate change and pressurizing China, they have been pressurizing China only because of one reason, that China's production centers, of course, they have been, you know, they have enhanced their production, and throughout the world, their trade is being seen everywhere. But when it comes to, you know, U.S. and China's conflict, I think out of this conflict, both of them, they would be sort of, you know, trying to go along with the things, and they will not want a resolve, a quick resolve to it, because end of the day, if we look at the Americans, what they're trying to do is they're trying to create insecurities for countries in the Asian Pacific, and on the hands of what? You know, they keep on deterring them about China, that China is, you know, a military power, and of course you need our support to be here. And you know, end of the day, we all see is that all of these countries like Japan, like South Korea, like Australia and India is becoming a big market for the American weaponry as well. And of course, in coming future, we will be seeing that American military equipment, it will be sold in all of these countries, and this is how the things would move on. This is how I see the things. I mean, they are just scaring all of the countries in the region, especially India. Why India? Because India is right next to China, and the immediate effect on any country that can you know, pose a threat to any country is India. And of course, we are seeing that Indians are buying drones. Indians are you know, taking lots of procurement from America, and this is how I see the things would move on. Both of the countries, to create a sort of balance in terms of scaring and in terms of you know, portraying it as a conflict, they would carry on doing this to the region.
Right, and the fact that the U.S. is quadrupling with India, Japan, and Australia, and the springing up of alliances like AUKUS, is that posing an actual threat of replacing the current alliances, emerging of new ones in terms of containing China's power in the region, Farah?
Right. I was fascinated by all three guests' answers, because I think that at this moment what Biden administration has been doing and what President Xi Jinping has been doing is basically mark their territories and define their powers. And then, of course, once you have actually, you negotiate through a point of strength, right? So both these parties have actually defined their strengths, and now they are going to enter into dialogue. This is exactly what was happening during President Trump's time as well. It was jaw, talk. As far as regional countries being frightened by China and the US playing any part in that, let me tell you that the prima donnas of India don't need any US to actually frighten them. They are good at theatrics, and they keep on actually scoring own goals. As far as Quad is concerned, remember there was a time when the Indian media was repeatedly telling us that Quad is this new alignment, and it is going to define the region. And then we saw AUKUS, and all of a sudden India was no more an element in that. So at this moment, this is basically both sides actually consolidating their positions. And to be honest, at this moment, I think both these leaders, when you talk about Xi Jinping, he has just managed that his party has actually adopted his resolution. That is a huge strength. That means he might be in power till 2027 at least. And when you talk about President Biden, despite the setback from Afghanistan, he has just passed his infrastructure bill, and in coming days we are going to see the Build Back Better bill also passing. After that, he will be also in a very strong position, despite the numbers which have been tanking of late. So I think that these powers actually use these elements and alliances to improve their negotiation position. Countries like India start inhaling their propaganda, thinking that there is going to be a war or there is going to be a Cold War. It doesn't work like that. This is 21st century. It is the third decade of 21st century. Of course, there will be confrontations, but the idea of decoupling will destroy everybody because the economies are so connected that COVID just reminded us how a global value chains were disrupted, and that cannot be afforded.
Right. Mr. Ayudma, considering the fact that Xi Jinping's third term in office is there, and then, of course, the strong position that Biden currently holds as well, as Farooq mentioned, how do you perceive the way that China is going to be able to engage with the U.S. and other members of the international community with Xi Jinping in office? Does this affect the way that they will be taking their relationship with the U.S. forward?
I think when Xi Jinping consolidated his position in China, especially within Chinese Communist Party, he has more freedom to engage with the United States. And also, of course, all these areas he can work with, basically, you have to avoid sensitive issues like Taiwan. So that's why I think, especially for economic cooperation, regional stability, climate change, will be good areas for China to cooperate. So I really expect in the future, both Biden administration and Xi Jinping, they will choose to cooperate in areas like this. It's easier to cooperate and maybe pave the way for some, other areas. But the fundamental structure, I would say, as Michael just mentioned, it's basically like a structure, a position. You may reduce the tension. You may increase the cooperation, but you cannot totally, pursue what China argued for a cooperation. And of course, Biden defined the relationship between China and the U.S. as competition. China, of course, not really happy, but I think China will have to accept it.
Right. Mr. Michael, considering that there is a possibility of the two leaders actually meeting, it was there before as well, but it didn't materialize. Do you think that the meeting that is scheduled most likely Monday next week is going to happen anytime soon or not? Is there the possibility that it may be cancelled?
Well, I'm not in a position to say. I'm not privy to the inside information, so to speak. But
sure.
If you look at some precedents, not too long ago, President Biden had a meeting with the Russian President Putin, and that was a surprise to many in the U.S. who thought it was too soon for Biden to be reaching out, so to speak, and engaging with a bitter competitor and rival. So perhaps you could look at that as precedent. I really think that Biden and the administration would like the meeting to take place. I think it's important to clear the air. There's never been a more important time to try to lower temperatures, so to speak, given what's been going on, for sure. So I think that if the meeting happens, that would be terrific. Again, there's no guarantee that it will, but there are issues to talk about, and certainly the difficult issues, the security issues, but also the climate issue, and also something like public health and pandemics. There's been so much discussion about how the pandemic has deepened the rivalry between the U.S. and China, especially because President Trump had blamed China for the pandemic. But public health can be a key area of collaboration between the two sides as well, quite frankly. The Quad may be focusing on vaccine production to push back against China's own vaccine diplomacy in Asia, but I really think that public health and pandemics, given the threat that poses, just like climate change, that's a logical space for collaboration between the two countries. So I really hope that the meeting happens, and if it doesn't happen, then it happens sometime soon, because quite frankly, the stakes are too high for the two leaders not to meet at the end of the day.
Right. Faisal, considering that, of course, there are hard limits and soft limits for anyone at the negotiating table, we've seen that, for example, issues like Taiwan or issues concerning China's sovereignty is a big no-no for China and perhaps for any nation. Considering these issues, if there is any possibility of the relationship between the U.S. and China easing, of course, we have issues like public health or climate change, but they can still be going on in the background, while issues such as the issue of Taiwan can still be happening. And considering the fact that China has a hard stance on issues like this, can a real reconciliation be still possible?
Sana, you are talking about an ideal situation where both of the countries, the biggest countries, the most important countries of the world, I mean, this is what the smaller countries expect from both of the countries for an ideal world. But as soon as, I mean, we see the things in the region, and especially when we talk about America and the Western countries, in recent times, certainly we started seeing that the issue of Hong Kong, Taiwan is not the only issue.
Yeah.
Issue of Hong Kong and Uyghur Muslims, it was exclusively highlighted throughout, and there were lobbies which were being used against China to diminish its face on a global side. And why it is happening? It is happening just to pressurize, just to bring on the level of their own on the table while they're sitting together. As my colleague, he has mentioned, Farooq has mentioned, that for the talks they want to have a level, and this is why they are doing it. And I believe, as you have mentioned, and as Mike has mentioned earlier as well, that issues like public health and they can be discussed and they can initiate through that. And as Farooq has earlier mentioned, that recently we had a pandemic, and it wasn't about the Western countries, it wasn't about, there was no clash of civilization in that. So I believe, we being humans from West or East or wherever, we must think about these things as a common thing, not as Eastern thing or Western thing, or as the previous president of US mentioned and kept on saying that Chinese virus. He wasn't calling it COVID-19. So I think we need to be careful. Plus, both of the biggest countries in terms of economy and in terms of their influence in the world, they need to be more responsible.
Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Hayuma and Mr. Michael Kirkleman, for joining us. Farooq, I'll take your last comments on this topic before we shed some light on the match that's going on as well.
Okay, I was just about to check the runs so far. Just to know, I thought that maybe we are concluding the program, but thank you very much for once again giving me the opportunity. Again, I will agree with what other participants were saying. One fact, despite there being huge pro-war or confrontation lobbies in both these capitals, the fact that sane voices like Michael Kugelman are there, and they are advocating some kind of a working relationship, that is great. Remember, President Xi, in the time of President Donald Trump, tried his level best to bridge the gap between the two countries. There was a consistent effort, but then because of trade, and Donald Trump's approach was that he actually threw everything at the trade negotiation. So at that time it seemed that there is going to be some confrontation, but in the end it was expected that had he returned to power, he would conclude the second round of FTA between the two countries, right? Trade agreement. So in coming days, I tell you, I believe that both these countries are going to work for improvement of their relationship. They are going to shore up, their positions, but still they will continue to work together. Remember, in the past 1 year, we have seen, because of the trade wars, from the shortage of microchips, to rising fuel prices, to medicines and umpteen other issues, we have seen a world which has been suffering. So this is not the time to actually fight. It is important to keep your own values close to your heart, but simultaneously humanity comes first. I don't want to agree with Huntington's definition or Toynbee's